I was sitting in the car, and it was already close to midnight. The road ahead was dark and empty, with only yellow streetlights sliding past the windows. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, the driver suddenly tightened his grip on the steering wheel and said, his voice low but clearly shaking, "You can't go home tonight." I thought I had misheard him. But then he continued, slowly, one word at a time. Someone had been watching me. That person knew exactly which days I worked and what time I came home. And tonight, while I was still at work, someone had stood in front of my house, tried the doorknob, looked inside. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I asked him who it was. He was silent for a few seconds, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. And the scariest part is, that person isn't a stranger. My name is Margaret. I'm 64 years old. I'm a widow, living alone in a small house and working the night shift just to make ends meet. I'm quiet. I don't draw attention. At my age, people often tend to overlook me. I'm no longer young, but I have never thought of myself as weak. If you're hearing these words and they feel familiar, if you believe that people who live quietly still have stories worth listening to, you might want to stay with this channel a little longer. Here we tell real-life stories where everyone deserves to be seen. My husband passed away on an early spring morning after more than 40 years together. There was no major incident, nothing dramatic. He simply grew weaker, and one day he didn't wake up. After the funeral, when everyone had gone home, the house became so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, and realized my life had just turned to an entirely different chapter. The life insurance was only enough to cover the funeral and a few final expenses. After that, I was on my own. My pension, which had been planned for 2 people, suddenly felt frighteningly thin. I began writing down every expense, cutting back on the most minor things. However, no matter how careful I was, the numbers at the end of the month still didn't add up. So at 61, I went back to work. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I found a night shift job at North Valley Medical Center in the administrative department, where I handled records and billing. The work was quiet, and no one paid much attention to me. I sat in a low-floor office, typing codes, checking paperwork, repeating the same tasks every shift. My shift started at 3 p.m. and ended close to midnight. 3 nights a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. I slowly adjusted to that rhythm, sleeping during the day, preparing simple meals in the afternoon, going to work at night, coming home in silence. The house I live in isn't big. 1 bedroom, a small living room, and a kitchen. I've lived there for over 20 years, and every corner is familiar. Every night before work, I lock the door carefully, turn on the porch light out of habit, then turn it off before getting into my car. I don't have close neighbors. We only exchange brief greetings when we happen to cross paths. At first, I thought loneliness was the worst part of it, but then I realized something more frightening, the feeling of slowly becoming invisible. At work, I was the oldest employee. In the neighborhood, I was the quiet widow. No one noticed when I left or when I came home. No one asked. I told myself that was probably a good thing, less trouble. But there were small things that unsettled me, though I didn't think much of them at the time. On a few mornings, I woke up to find the porch light still on, even though I clearly remembered turning it off before leaving for work. I blamed my age and my memory. Another time, when I pulled back the curtains, I saw a car parked at the end of the street, engine running but lights off. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't think it mattered. At my age, people often say you shouldn't overthink things. I just kept living by my familiar routine, trying to keep everything orderly and straightforward. I didn't know that this very consistency, this quiet, predictable life, was what made me noticeable in a way I had never imagined. And I didn't know that just a few weeks later, a minor change in my commute would lead me to an encounter that would turn everything upside down. Things began to change toward the end of that summer when the night bus route I relied on was cut back. I found out one evening while standing at my usual stop and saw a new notice posted on the pole. The last bus now leaves nearly half an hour earlier. That meant I would have to leave work before my shift ended or find an alternative way home. I couldn't leave early. I needed an hour every day to cover my expenses, and I no longer had the strength to walk a long distance at night, especially after a full shift. I stood in the hospital hallway that night, staring at the clock, my chest feeling heavy. For the first time in years, I honestly didn't know how I would manage. That weekend, my daughter called. She lives far away, several states from me, but she still calls every Sunday. When I told her about the bus being cut, she was quiet for a few seconds, then told me to take out my phone. She guided me step by step, helping me install a ride-hailing app. It felt unfamiliar. I had never used anything like that before, but she told me to try it for safety. The first night I ordered a ride, I stood by the employee entrance of the medical center. It was dark, the parking lot mostly empty. I held my phone in my hand, my heart beating faster than usual. When the car pulled up, I hesitated for a moment. It was a silver sedan, not a new one. The driver rolled down the window and looked at me through the rear-view mirror. He looked to be in his early 50s. Dark, hair streaked with gray, a tired face, deep lines around his eyes. He nodded at me, polite but not overly friendly. I opened the door, sat in the back seat, and gave him my address. "Long shift?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Same as always," I replied. 3 nights a week. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. The car pulled out of the lot. There was no music, just the sound of the engine and the tires on the road. I found that comforting. We exchanged a few simple words, the weather, the empty streets. He told me his name was Daniel. I told him mine. Nothing special, but one thing caught my attention. He didn't look at me in the mirror with curiosity or suspicion. Just a brief glance, enough to know I was fine. The ride lasted a little over 10 minutes. When the car stopped in front of my house, he wished me a good night. I thanked him and stepped out. The porch light came on as usual. I locked the door and thought that maybe this arrangement wasn't as bad as I had feared. On the nights that followed, I continued to order rides. It wasn't always Daniel, but it often was. Gradually, I grew used to his presence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he listened. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions. He never seemed impatient. I didn't feel unsafe sitting in his car. I didn't feel the need to be on guard. It was simply the feeling of being near someone who had also been through many things in life. Someone who didn't need to prove anything, and in those quiet, late-night rides that, for me, was more than enough. After a few weeks, I began to notice something. Every time I requested a ride during my usual hours, Daniel's name appeared on the screen. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. The area wasn't large, and there weren't many drivers working night shifts. But by the 4th or 5th time, I no longer believed it was random. I didn't ask. Daniel didn't explain. Everything happened naturally. I walked out of the employee entrance of the medical center, waited a few minutes, and the familiar silver car pulled up. I got into the back seat. He nodded in greeting. I gave my address. The car moved forward. That was enough. Our conversations didn't start out deep. Most of the time, they were just polite exchanges. I said I was tired. He said the roads were quiet. Some nights we were almost silent the entire ride, but that silence didn't make me uncomfortable. It felt like two people who were already used to not needing to fill every empty space with words. Gradually, we started talking more, not because we tried to, but because it happened naturally. Daniel told me he used to work at a lumber mill until it shut down. Following that came a prolonged period of struggle. He drove almost every day, sometimes more than 10 hours, not because he enjoyed it, but because he needed the money. One night, while we were stopped at a red light, he quietly told me that his wife had left a few years earlier. No big arguments, no betrayal, just exhaustion. tired of being short on money, tired of promises that couldn't be kept. Their daughter had grown and had gone with her mother. Now he lived alone in a small apartment near the highway. I didn't know what to say that would be the right thing to say. I simply said I understood, because I lived alone too. Daniel didn't ask for anything more, but I could feel that it was enough. Maybe that was why I started tipping him a few extra dollars each ride. Not much, just a little. The first time he noticed, he told me I didn't have to do that. I smiled and said it was because he drove carefully. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Thank you," his voice softer than usual. By November, the nights were getting colder. One evening, while getting coffee from the cafeteria before my shift ended, I suddenly thought of Daniel. I bought an extra cup. When he arrived, I handed it to him through the window. He looked at the coffee for a few seconds, as if he didn't quite understand what was happening. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," I replied, "but that coffee helps you stay awake." He took it, didn't say anything else. But the entire ride home, I could tell he felt more at ease. That night, when I stepped out of the car, he thanked me again. From then on, coffee became a habit. Some nights it was black coffee. Some nights it was hot chocolate when it was especially cold. I didn't think much of it. I just figured that if I was already getting one, an extra cup didn't matter. But I could clearly see the appreciation in the way Daniel accepted it. He never took it for granted, never acted entitled. We kept an apparent distance. I didn't ask him too many questions about his life. He didn't pry into my past. There was no flirting, no ambiguity, just two people who had been through many losses, sharing the same car late at night. For me, those rides became rare bright spots in the week. Not because anything special happened, but because I no longer felt completely alone. Someone asked how my day had been. Someone remembered which days I worked. For someone my age, that meant far more than most people realize. Once, Daniel said, almost without thinking, that he was used to being treated as if he didn't exist. People got into the car, stared at their phones, and then said the address, after which they went silent. Hearing that made my throat tighten. I had never thought about it that way. To me, he was the person who got me home safely after every shift. But to many others, he was just the driver's seat in front. Out of those tiny things, a quiet connection formed. No noise, no display, just the steady presence of two lonely people who happened to see each other during a fragile chapter of their lives. And I had no idea that this simple connection would become the very reason we would both be forced to face a far more terrifying truth. The change didn't occur immediately. It came slowly. Slowly enough that at first I thought I was imagining it. Daniel still picked me up regularly. The silver car still stopped in the same place, but something was different. He spoke less. The familiar check-in questions became less frequent. On some stretches of road, he was silent for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I assumed he was tired. Everyone goes through that. I didn't ask. But then, during one ride, he suddenly asked me questions he had never asked before. "How many days a week do you work?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the road. "3, I answered. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday." He nodded and said nothing else. A few days later, he asked again, "What time do you usually get home?" His tone was light, but I could tell the question had been carefully considered. I answered as I usually would. I didn't think it was strange. We'd talked about more personal things than that. But after that, he started asking about my neighborhood, whether it was crowded, whether I knew anyone well. I told him briefly that I didn't really know anyone, just a few people who greeted each other when they happened to meet. One time, when the car turned onto the street leading to my house, I mentioned a man who lived nearby. Not a friend, just a familiar face. I occasionally saw him coming and going, often parking his pickup truck at the end of the street. I said it casually without giving it any thought. Daniel didn't respond right away. He stayed silent for the rest of the ride. When we stopped in front of my house, he wished me good night as usual, but his voice sounded strained. From that night on, I noticed that he often looked at his phone when the car came to a stop. not scrolling, writing things down. I saw the screen light up with short lines of text, dates, times, locations. When I asked, he said it was just a habit. I didn't push. Another time, while we were waiting at a red light, he asked if I ever felt like someone was watching me. The question made my stomach drop. I thought about the car that had once been parked at the end of the street, thought about the porch light turning on for no apparent reason, but I didn't want to scare myself. I shook my head and said, "Probably not." Daniel didn't seem relieved by my answer. If anything, he grew quieter. Some nights he looked like he wanted to say something, then stopped himself. I sensed that hesitation, but I didn't press. At my age, I understand that some things people need to decide for themselves when to say. Later on, Daniel told me that during that time, he had been deeply conflicted. He was afraid he was overthinking things, afraid he had misheard a few comments in the car and was connecting dots that didn't belong together. He worried that if he spoke up, I would panic, lose sleep, or worse, stop feeling safe in my own home. He was also afraid for himself, afraid that if he accused someone incorrectly, he would lose the only job keeping him afloat, afraid of being seen as nosy, afraid of being misunderstood. Some nights he deleted all the notes on his phone, telling himself he was imagining things, but specific details kept repeating. The same neighborhood, the same schedule, the same name was mentioned in conversations he overheard by chance, and each time the sense of unease inside him grew a little stronger. As for me, I continued living my steady routine, going to work, coming home, drinking coffee with Daniel in the car. I didn't know that while I believed I was living a quiet, safe life, unsettling pieces were slowly falling into place, right in front of someone alert enough to see them, but still uncertain about whether he should speak up. That night was a Thursday evening. It was colder than usual, and the wind was strong as I stepped out of the employee entrance of the medical center. I was used to feeling exhausted after my shift, so when I got into the car, I didn't immediately notice anything was wrong until Daniel didn't turn onto the familiar road. I looked out the window, then up at the rearview mirror. "We're going the wrong way," I said calmly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He slowed the car, then said very slowly, "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to trust me." His voice was noticeably different from his usual tone. The familiar gentleness was gone. My throat went dry. "Daniel, what's going on?" He took a deep breath. "Someone has been talking about you, more than once." I sat up straight. "Talking about me? How?" "About your work schedule, about your house, and about dealing with you." At first, I didn't fully understand what that word meant. "Dealing with?" I was about to ask, but Daniel turned into the parking lot of an abandoned store. It was completely dark, lit only by a single security light that shone down on the cracked asphalt. He parked the car, turned off the engine, and turned fully toward me. "I don't want you going home tonight," he said. "I can't let you go." I started to tremble. "Daniel, you're scaring me." "I know," he said immediately, "and I'm sorry, but I would rather have you angry with me than have you in danger." He took out his phone. His hands were slightly shaking, but his movements were firm. He opened a notes app and turned the screen toward me. There was a long list: dates, times, pickup locations, short lines recording fragments of conversations. "I started writing things down after the second time," he said. "At first I thought I'd misheard, but then it came up again. The same neighborhood, the same schedule. Your name." I stared at the screen, not fully understanding. "Who is this person?" "I don't want to say the name right now," he replied, "but this person isn't a stranger to you." He opened another folder. "I also have recordings." I looked up at him. "Recordings?" "Audio only," he said quickly, "for safety. Passengers agree to that when using the app." He pressed play on a short clip. A man's voice came through, drunk, slurred. I recognized the setting immediately, inside a car, at night. There was rough laughter, then a sentence that made my blood run cold. That old woman comes home late a few nights a week. House is empty. Needs to be handled before she makes trouble. I covered my mouth. My ears rang. Daniel stopped the recording. I have several clips like that, he said. Not all of them are clear, but enough that I couldn't ignore it. I shook my head over and over. That can't be right. I haven't done anything. I don't know anything. I know, he said at once. That's exactly why I'm worried. He looked straight at me. Tonight, before picking you up, I drove past your house. My heart stopped. My house? There was a car parked out front, he said. Lights off, engine running. I saw the person get out, walk up to your door. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Then what? The person tried the door, Daniel said. Turned the knob, looked inside, stood there for almost a minute, then went back to the car. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears spilt over. I felt nauseous. I clutched the side of the seat. If I had come home earlier, if I hadn't worked tonight... Don't, Daniel said firmly. Don't blame yourself. You did nothing wrong. But I wasn't really hearing him anymore. There was only one thought in my mind. I had lived too quietly, too predictably. I thought I was invisible. I thought no one noticed. And that was precisely what made me a target. I sat in that car in the middle of an empty parking lot, and for the first time in many years, I was terrified. Not because of the darkness, but because I realized that someone had been watching me for a long time, without me ever knowing. We arrived at the police station after midnight. The building was brightly lit, but the atmosphere was quiet and serene. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands tightly clasped together, still trembling. Daniel sat beside me, back straight, silent, as if reminding himself to stay completely calm. A young officer spoke with us first. He listened, nodded, and took notes. But I could see a hint of hesitation in his eyes. I didn't blame him. An older woman, a rideshare driver, overheard conversations in a car. It all sounded questionable. If I were in his place, I might have doubted it too. When Daniel took out his phone and opened his notes and audio recordings, the mood in the room began to change. An older investigator was called in. He sat down and listened to each clip without interrupting. I watched his face as the broken, drunken voices echoed in the small room. With each recording, his expression grew more serious. "Do you know why this person might be paying attention to you?" he asked me. I shook my head. "I just go to work and come home. I don't cause trouble with anyone." He nodded, then asked more about my job. I told him I worked in the administrative department of the medical center, night shift, lower floor, near the record storage area. When I said that, I noticed his gaze pause for a moment. "The person the driver mentioned," he said slowly, "also works at the same center, night shift." I felt a chill run down my spine. The same workplace? He explained that the man worked in maintenance and nighttime sanitation. He had an access badge. He could enter many areas after regular hours. I closed my eyes for a moment. A vague image surfaced in my mind. A man I had passed a few times in the hallway, a baseball cap, pushing a utility cart. I had never really looked at his face. "When you mentioned working on the lower floor," the investigator continued, "have you heard about any missing files?" The question startled me. "Yes," I answered immediately. "A little over a month ago, a few paper files couldn't be found. We thought they had been misplaced." I told him about the internal review that was underway. Nothing major, but enough to create pressure. Records belonging to elderly patients, payments that needed to be reconciled. My voice began to shake as I spoke because at that moment, everything started to connect frighteningly. If someone is committing fraud, the investigator said, and knows that you work nights, are consistently present, and take part in reviewing records, then you could become a problem. I understood immediately, not because I knew too much, but because I could know. And to someone doing something wrong, that possibility alone was dangerous enough. Daniel lowered his head, his hands clenched. I knew he was blaming himself for not speaking up sooner. As for me, I felt hollow. I had thought my quiet life was safe. I never imagined that quietness would make me an easy target. The investigator continued, his tone more serious. The man may have tried to get into my house to see whether I had taken any paperwork home, any notes, any evidence that could link him to the missing files, and if he found something, he might not have stopped there. When I heard that, I could barely stay seated. I thought about my desk drawer, thought about the papers I had brought home to review, just to be sure. Not originals, but enough to raise questions. I realized how careless I had been. The police made no immediate promises. They said they needed to investigate and verify everything. But they were very clear about one thing. I could not go home that night. They would arrange for me to stay somewhere safe while they sought a search warrant. As I stood up to leave the room, I glanced back at Daniel. If it hadn't been for him, I would have gone home as usual. Opened the door, turned on the lights, thinking I was just an invisible old woman. Thinking no. One noticed. That night, in the temporary shelter, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I understood that some forms of evil are quiet. They hide in routines, in habits, and in the belief that an older adult living alone is of no concern to anyone. Everything happened faster than I expected, but without any noise. There were no sirens, no chaos. Just late-night phone calls, uniformed officers speaking in low voices, and procedures carried out carefully. The next morning, I was told that the police had obtained a search warrant. They went to the man's residence before daylight entirely broke. Meanwhile, I remained in the temporary room, sitting on the bed, holding a cup of cold water without drinking it. I didn't want details. I just waited for the result. When the investigator called me, his voice was calm and clear. They had found what they needed. Boxes of files, documents that didn't belong to him, copies, irregular payments. Everything is hidden in a garage and a locked room. Everything was neatly organized, as if it had been done over a long period of time. The man was arrested later that same day. No resistance, no excuses. I wasn't there. And I was glad. I didn't want to see him in handcuffs. I didn't want to hear any explanations. What I needed to know, I already knew. The police told me I could return home in the afternoon. Before I left, they checked the entire house, doors, windows. Everything was intact. There were no signs of a successful break-in. That brought some relief, but it didn't erase the lingering unease. When I stepped back inside my home, the familiar space suddenly felt strange. I stood in the doorway for a long time before fully entering. The living room looked the same. The furniture was where it always had been, but I no longer saw it with the same eyes. I turned on the lights, even though it was still daylight. I checked every lock, even though I knew it wasn't necessary. I was safe. That was true. But I no longer felt secure the way I once had. At night, I startled at the smallest sounds. A tree branch brushing against the window was enough to wake me. I understood then that cracks aren't always visible. Some cracks exist on the inside. Daniel came to see me that afternoon, not through the app. He just stopped by to ask if I was okay. We sat in the living room and spoke to each other very little. I looked at him and said, "Thank you." Not with a speech, just 2 simple words. He nodded as if nothing more was needed. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, a deep sense of relief mixed with exhaustion, as if I had walked a long road without ever knowing it in advance. I didn't wish suffering on that man. I only wanted everything to stop there. To me, justice isn't revenge. Justice is being able to keep living without constantly looking over your shoulder. It's locking your door at night without wondering who might be standing on the other side. And although I know it will take time for the feeling of safety to return, I am sure of one thing. Some terrible things did not happen, and that alone is more than enough. Things didn't return to normal right away. There are wounds you can't see, and they take time to heal. But little by little, Daniel's life and mine began to settle into a different rhythm. Slower, calmer. Daniel still drove me to work 3 nights a week, not out of obligation, but because we had both grown used to each other's presence. I no longer sat in the back seat, I sat in the front. We talked more, but not about what had happened, just small things. The weather, a good meal, a day that felt a little less tiring than the last. A few weeks later, Daniel received a phone call one evening. I was in the car when his phone buzzed. He stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. When he hung up, his eyes were red. He said his daughter had called. She had heard about the incident, heard that he had testified, heard that he had done something this time that he hadn't been able to do in the past. His daughter told him she had been angry with him for a long time, not only because of what had happened to her, but because of the feeling of being abandoned. But after reading about my story, she realized her father had changed, not through words, but through actions. She said she wanted to see him, wanted him to meet his grandchild for the first time. Daniel told me this with a trembling voice. I didn't know what to say except to place my hand over his. There are moments when words are unnecessary. For me, the change came more quietly. I no longer felt empty when I came home, not because I wasn't alone anymore, but because I knew I hadn't been forgotten. I was invited to small meals, nothing fancy, just weekend dinners with children's laughter, someone asking if I was tired, someone remembering what dishes I liked. They called me Aunt Margaret. Not out of politeness, but because I genuinely had a place in their lives. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I was simply myself, there, close enough to be cared about. We didn't talk much about the past. No one blamed anyone. No one sought revenge. What had happened was put back where it belonged, like a lesson, like a reminder that there are mistakes that can't be erased, but you can keep living without letting them define everything. I realized that what hurt me most wasn't the fear, but the feeling that I had once believed I didn't matter. At this age, my presence had no value, but it was the small things that proved otherwise. A cup of coffee, a simple check-in, someone willing to listen. I began to pay more attention to the people around me. At work, I became more patient with younger employees just starting out. In the neighborhood, I stopped to talk for a few extra minutes, not because I wanted to become someone else, but because I understood what it felt like to be overlooked. Family, I learned, isn't only about blood. Family is composed of the people who choose to stay together, those who choose to care, those who choose to see one another, even when there's no particular reason. There was no miracle here, just kindness repeated day after day. And in that quiet persistence, both Daniel and I found something we had thought we had lost. Not the past, but the feeling of belonging. I am 65 years old now. I still work the night shift at the medical center, still sit at the same familiar desk, processing each file slowly and carefully. From the outside, my life hasn't changed much, but inside, it has. I no longer feel like I'm simply getting through each day. A few weeks ago, a young woman started working there. She sat at the desk across from mine, struggling with the codes, her face tense. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she typed and saw her eyes well up when she thought no one was paying attention. I had been like that once, just at a different stage of my life. During a break, I brought her a cup of coffee. I didn't say much. I just sat down, showed her how to do the work, and told her that things would get easier. She looked at me and said, "Thank you." Her voice quiet but sincere. I knew that feeling. The feeling of being seen. I thought about Daniel, about the silver car, about those quiet late nights. I thought about how everything could have turned out very differently if not for a few small actions at the right time. Not grand gestures, just care, given at the right moment to the right person. Family, to me now, is no longer a rigid concept. Family is the place you can return to, no matter how late it is. It's where someone asks how your day was and truly wants to hear the answer. Family can also be built from people who don't share your blood, but who choose to stay together. I have learned that older people are not invisible. We may be quiet, but we are not insignificant. We can still make a difference simply by being a little kinder, a little more attentive. If you are listening to this story, no matter your age, I hope you remember one thing. Small kindnesses are quiet. They ask for nothing, but sometimes they are precisely what stops a tragedy from happening. What pulls someone back, and sometimes what saves a life.